Right, okay, folks, we are live once again. So, just had a few camera glitches there. All right, we're only running 1 minute over schedule, so we'll just give it a few more seconds, and then focus for tonight is exam technique, because the last 3 lives I've done have focused on content. It's been content, and as you know, in A-level geography, about 25% is content. The remainder of that is how you apply it, and particularly applying it to very tricky exam style questions. So that's what I want to be doing more of a focus on. Now, you can't get to the exam technique point unless you've done that content focus. So now going through all of that content for 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3, where we were looking at the slow geological cycle, fast biological cycle, and then what happens when we unbalance the carbon cycle. We can now attempt this 20-mark question here, but what we're not doing is just regurgitating content. What we're doing here is using content in a very specific way, and it's meeting this crucial command word that is going to be able to get us the marks. So what I'm first going to do is take you through how these 20 markers are actually marked by examiners, just to give you an insight into the marking points, really, what you're trying to aim for so you can get the highest mark possible. Then I'm going to give you a strategy for whatever evaluate question you come across, you can use to start thinking about and planning for your 20 markers. And then what we'll do is we'll go through the content specifics. Okay, so that's the trickier part, is actually thinking, right, now I know, I've got the general blueprints for how to do well in a 20-mark response, but what I don't have is the content. So we can go through that. That for me is the easier solve than the other stuff. So we'll start with what do we actually mean by the word evaluate. So if you're in upper sixth as opposed to lower sixth, you'll be far more experienced with these, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've mastered them yet. They might still be a struggle for you. If you're in lower sixth, these are the things that are making you think, wow, Geography A-level is significantly more difficult than GCSE. Yeah, and it is. That jump up is absolutely enormous. So it doesn't matter where you are in A-level geography, the strategy that I'm going to go through now to help you, it will improve your 20-mark responses, even just from the perspective you're going to start writing in the correct way. So if we just look at this as a command word, the command word requires you to make a judgment. Okay, so you've got to make a judgment, and normally what would be the case is that you're making a judgment on a viewpoint. So it's almost as though someone's just burst into a room and they've presented a viewpoint to you, and you've got to almost debate that viewpoint that's just been thrown out there, because that's all that the examiner is expecting you to do. You've got to show that you can debate on a piece of paper, and it's got to be this evolving debate, this coherent evolving debate. If it isn't, if it's one-sided, you're going to really struggle to get out of level 1, okay? Which I'll come on to in a second. So you've got to meet that command word. They're also expecting you to use a range of content as well. These are normally the questions that separate out students in terms of their grade boundaries. Questions before this are usually kind of very much knowledge-based, bar the 12 markers. So your 20 markers is your opportunity to really show off what you've got. If you only draw on a very narrow or limited amount of content, again, you're not going to score as high a level, okay? And that includes, obviously, theory. So A-level standard theory, not just like your GCSE standard theory, and it involves case study stuff as well. So there's all these factors that will go into the evaluate essay, okay, and particularly this one here. So if you imagine an evaluate essay like you're in a courtroom, you've got the prosecution and the defense. How well the prosecution makes their case or how well the defense defends is based on evidence. You need evidence to back up what your opinion is, and these are opinion-based responses. Now, depending on what you write, the examiner will put you into different level brackets. Okay? The one you want to be aiming for is level 4. Yeah, you definitely want to be aiming for that level 4 bracket. Because with level 4, if the examiner has established that reading through your response that you are in that level, you are scoring anything between 16 to 20 out of 20. Now, scoring 20 out of 20 is very rare. It's just some examiners just don't like giving 20 out of 20. It's really rare, even though the mark schemes will say you can give 20 out of 20 if you feel like it deserves it. Examiners just don't want to. So it's more common that you'll score between like 16 to 19, okay? But you can get here with a few tips and tricks. So what does that involve? Well, as we've already said, range of content. Now that means the crucial word with your level 4 is this word here, throughout, yeah? So if you utilize a range of relevant and accurate content, so that accurate side of things, so you've not got a thing wrong, or maybe you've just got one tiny thing, maybe a little bit wrong in your theory. If you've been relevant and accurate in terms of your knowledge throughout, then you can hit level 4. What they also want to see is if you've been judgmental throughout, using words like more, less, agree to a certain extent, most important, least important, then you're showing that you are using judgmental language and you're being judgmental. And then you can score those marks for that. Yeah? So that's what we're aiming for here. Range of knowledge and being judgmental. Easier said than done. This is just the basics here, guys. So you can't necessarily think, oh, right, nailed it. Going to absolutely smash a 20 marker now. We've got to actually think what that means. So it's not necessarily the range of content that the students find the most difficult. It's finding your opportunities to make judgments and to agree or disagree with the view. So whenever you see this here, the view, what you've got to think about is that a viewpoint is quite simply just a perspective. And this is a concept that I've been bringing in with my lower and my upper sixth this year, this idea of perspective. Whether you agree or disagree with a viewpoint is very much based on your perspective, okay? And so I've been giving them this tool for them to engage with before they even start the 20 marker or any 20 marker, it doesn't matter what module it's in, which is something I coined last year, which is the wheel of AO2. Yeah, so your mark schemes are broken down into AO1 and AO2 marks. In your 20 markers, you get 5 marks for the use of AO1, which is knowledge. Yeah, essentially, how good's your knowledge? AO2 is the application of that knowledge, and you will score it for applying it well and meeting the command word. So we can consider any debate in any 20 marker, I think anyway, from the following perspectives. The first of these is place. Okay, so the question that I get my students to ask is, when there's a viewpoint presented in an evaluate question, is this viewpoint true in all places? Yeah, is this true in all places? Or can I present that it's true in most places, but there are some where it's not true, giving us an alternative viewpoint of, well, whether this viewpoint is true or not massively depends on the place, okay? The next one is spatial scale. So in geography, particularly physical geography, this is going to be one of your most useful perspectives. So you can look at an argument or you can look at a viewpoint from various different spatial scales. You can look at it from, just generally speaking, the local scale. Now that's quite a broad concept in itself. What do we mean by local? Well, local can mean something like a village, it can mean something like a town, it can mean a city, it can mean like a region, or it can just mean within the local vicinity. Essentially, at a kind of smaller spatial scale. Yeah. If we're getting more specific in terms of our modules, let's say it's coasts, it could be like a tiny stretch of coastline. We can also go right up to the largest of our spatial scales, which is global. Yeah, so, or otherwise large. Now, there's any number of spatial scales in between all of these things. It could be this individual meander versus the entire stretch of river or the entire drainage basin. You're comparing things at different spatial scales. So once again, is it true at all spatial scales? Chances are there's no viewpoint that is true at every single spatial scale. Again, there can be viewpoints that are true at most spatial scales. However, there will be some spatial scales where this viewpoint could be questioned, or where there might be something more important or more influential. Yeah. Next is going to be temporal scale. So temporal scale, once again, we can go from small temporal scales like minutes right up to large spatial scales where we're talking like eons, yeah, or larger, or across the Holocene, across the Pleistocene, that kind of thing. Larger spatial scales over longer time periods, over the long term, short term, yeah, that's your temporal scale. So once again, is our viewpoint true? Well, our viewpoint is potentially true over the long term, but the short term, give an example of both of these timescales, it may not be true. Okay, so even if you just used these, you would have enough to be evaluative in 3 different paragraphs. Yeah, so you're bringing in those judgments, and I'll show you how you do this when we get on to the actual answering of the question. Now, the other ones that we can have are more people-based ones. Okay, so a viewpoint is often presented by a person. Yeah, and the importance of something is often judged by a person. And if we think about it in geography, we break down our people groups into key players and stakeholders as well. But essentially, they're just different people, different groups. It could be national government, local government. It could be environmentalists. It could be all sorts of people. Do all people agree with this viewpoint? Or do different people have completely different and contrasting viewpoints? Yeah, so it could be a paragraph about depends who you ask. They would say yes. They would say no. They would agree. They wouldn't know. And then our final one would be, if applicable, there's always futures. Yeah, so if a question is evaluate the view to which something will increasingly contribute to this over time and in the future, that can be like a futures paragraph, so in the future. And you can always add on to the end of this uncertainties. It is absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine in geography to say that to actually come to a decision about whether we agree with this viewpoint or not is a huge uncertainty, because there's not enough science, there's not enough data, there's not enough people's opinions on this. Yeah, so that for me covers all of your bases in terms of your paragraphs. Okay, so what I'm going to try to show you now is how you can structure your 20 marks around this idea of perspectives. And I've taught my students that you got to build up these perspective paragraphs where you're debating within the paragraphs. And it's something quite new that I've been experimenting with. So your first paragraph, whatever that viewpoint there, and we'll come on to that, my recommendation is open up and just agree with the view. Okay? Open your paragraph opening, Just go straight in and agree with the view. And try and get range into this paragraph. So this will be quite a big one. It'll be a big paragraph. Now what you're doing in there is you're trying to score maximum AO1 credit. But immediately what it gives the examiner is, right, this student knows what they're talking about. They've got a ton of knowledge here. I haven't seen them be evaluative, but I know for a fact that they're able to agree with this viewpoint and put a solid case forward. Within this paragraph, it's filled with theory, it's filled with processes, well-explained processes. You've got some case studies in there. You've got plenty of facts and figures. It's the perfect paragraph. And I always say when it's a range, try to aim for like 3 ideas. Yeah. If you can't do 3, do 2. If you can't do 2, do 1. But as many ideas as you can hope for, because you don't want to over agree over one side in the initial paragraph, because then you might run out of time and then you've not shown those evaluation skills. Then what you're going to do in the next paragraph, and always open it with the word however. Now just writing the word however doesn't mean that you're being evaluative. Yeah, doesn't mean that you're being evaluative. Writing the word however is the signal to the examiner that you are about to be evaluative, but it doesn't mean like, oh, you're going to score evaluation marks just because you've written the word however. Nothing frustrates me more than that. So however, what you do there is you link back to this original paragraph here and say, right, if we're honest, we've only considered this from this perspective. So I've spoken about X, Y, and Z. And sure, that's true in most places, let's say, or that's true at most spatial scales or temporal scales. What you do is you take one of the perspectives, and let's say we label these 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yeah? Let's say, why don't we consider this from a different spatial scale or from different spatial scales? And then what you do is you go through all the different spatial scales and say whether at those different spatial scales you can agree with the view or you might disagree with the view. Yeah? You do the same. You go then for another perspective paragraph. What about if we consider it from different time scales? I mean, at this time scale, we'd agree with the view. At this time scale, don't know really. Bit of a mix. Hard to say. At this time scale, I'd actually disagree with the view. And what about this? Yeah? Summary, it's difficult, it's nuanced. It's nuanced. And then finally, try and go for a 4th paragraph where you've got another spatial scale. And it might be something, I don't know, something like futures, future uncertainties. The future's unknown. We don't know about positive and negative feedback mechanisms. Yeah? The data's not checked out yet. There's so much we still don't know about X, Y, and Z. In conclusion, because you need a conclusion, your conclusion then goes into where can we certainly agree with the viewpoint. Yeah, so you break it up into 2 parts. Where can we certainly agree with the viewpoint? And then you'd follow up with, but there's nuances to this debate. Yeah, so it might be that when we consider it from the long term, of course we're going to say this. Yeah, of course, in the spatial scale of analysis, of course we're going to say this. However, we disagree with the view at this spatial scale of analysis. We can fundamentally say no. Okay, so you're ruling out where you can say yes, we agree with the view, and you're ruling out where you can say and you're confirming where you can say no. All right, so that for me is your approach that you want to take with every 20 marker. Before you even start planning, think about what are the perspectives that you can consider this 20 marker from. So I would get any 20 marker as a follow-up to this video, get any 20 marker and just try it out. Just see. It takes practice, it takes time, and this might be something completely new to you, but what this will do is it will make sure that you are being evaluative. And that's all you've got to do, really. That's all you've got to do. Right, so now let's look at this in terms of specifics, okay? And what we're going to do is just go through a few potential ideas. I'm going to break down what you need to write about in terms of content, and then we can demonstrate where we might get certain paragraphs from, all right? Okay, so it wants us to talk about human activities, okay? So that's the first thing you do. Once you know that you've got your perspectives, you've got to just kind of break down the question and see what it wants from you. A few different human activities. We can think of deforestation. We can think of combustion as well. We can think of agriculture. We can think of things like mining and every offshoot from combustion. It could be industry, it could be transport, all of those things there. So as long as you've got a good list of human activities that you can bring in maybe to that original paragraph, so how are all of these things influencing carbon cycle? All right, so when we're thinking about the fast biological cycle, we've already been through that, haven't we? So this is now where we're drawing on our ideas from 6.2. So we know that in the fast biological cycle, we can break it down into the oceans, and we can break it down into the terrestrial biosphere. So we know that in the oceans, any of the actions we're talking about here, we may have to link to the 3 pumps. In the terrestrial biosphere, again, we're linking to processes such as photosynthesis. We might be linking to decomposition. We might be linking to respiration. We know that we're potentially going to have to talk about vegetation, soils, things like wetlands. We know that's going to come into it. So we're already thinking here about quite a range of things, aren't we? And then the slow geological cycle, if we remember there, we are talking there about, well, there's only a few really, aren't there? So we know that there's volcanic outgassing. We know as well that there's chemical weathering. We know that part of the slow geological cycle is fossil fuels as well. And then there's any of the processes in between, aren't there? So it could be that, remember, we're trying to get back to the lithosphere here. So it could be kind of sedimentation, it could be solution, it could be, there's any number of things that we could talk about in this. And this is why this is such a good revision question. So remember, our opening paragraph needs to be on the agree side. Okay, so what you'd want to try and do is take 3 of these things. So let's go with deforestation, combustion, and agriculture. They're 3 easy starting points to go for with the agree side of the paragraph. So we say, well, yeah, I mean, human society has had an enormous impact on the fast biological cycle, so the cycling of carbon. So deforestation, let's say, that represents a kind of land use change, doesn't it? So this is both a direct and an indirect impact on the fast biological cycle. And what you want to do is link that to, well, the first thing that we've got is without the trees, we know that there's going to be decreased photosynthesis. And what that means is that there's then less carbon dioxide fixing into biomass, and then there may even as well be decreased oxygen created. Because of this, there's then less leaf litter, which means there's less decomposition into soils, and then there's less carbon stored in the soils. In addition to this, obviously, we can bring in the water cycle. So when flooding occurs, we might get soil erosion. So that might mean there's less carbon stored in soils, and more of that then goes to the oceans. So you can, I mean, we could go on for ages talking about all the different ways that this human activity here, deforestation, impacts the carbon cycle. And that's all you've got to do in as many ways as possible. So we've got the theory in there, where you might want to say that there is large volumes of deforestation is in the Amazon. So that's 17% of that's been deforested. Again, you could talk about Indonesia. You could talk about any of the things in there where we could agree with the fact that there are large impacts of human activities on the fast biological cycle. Now, the first way that you're going to agree with this is that there's just such an enormous range of ways in which humans are affecting the fast biological cycle compared to the slow geological cycle. So you'd compare this range of ways, and you'd probably say something along the lines of, now, it's not that we don't impact the slow geological cycle, it's that just we do it in far less ways. The only way we really do that is with the increased combustion of fossil fuels. Yeah. So just from that extraction process and from that usage process, yes, that means that we've got more CO2 in the atmosphere, which impacts on chemical weathering, which impacts on solution, and impacts on the amount of carbonates in the oceans. Okay, so that's it, isn't it? Yeah, that's it. So it's just comparing the range of ways, and that's an easy agree point to put in response to this question here. Okay, so that's obviously not the extent of the content that we go through. We go through all of this stuff here, and then that makes a solid agree paragraph. But then it's easy, isn't it? The range of stuff. So it's a small amount of stuff. So then what we have to do is think, well, how can we actually look at this from a different perspective? So this is the tricky part. Okay, because once you've exhausted this is where a lot of students in this exam thought, right, I'm stuck now, I don't know what to write. So let's just take one of our perspectives. Let's go spatial scale. Yeah, so we'll go spatial scale. So the only perspective that we've considered this argument from so far is that we've just done it based on numbers, really. The number of ways in which we impact the fast biological cycle, the number of ways in which we impact the slow geological cycle. All right. So if we go on spatial scale, what we've probably done there is we've considered that it's probably most important when we consider our impacts at the local scale. Yeah, at the local scale. When we consider the impacts at the global scale, we might well come to the conclusion that maybe we are actually impacting the slow geological cycle to a greater degree than we're impacting the fast biological cycle, because your slow geological cycle is global in its extent, whereas your fast biological cycle is quite simply a collection of local cycles. And it's because the slow geological cycle, so much of a part of that is the atmosphere, and through the combustion of fossil fuels, which come from the slow geological cycle, are entering the global commons, and that then has an impact on the entire slow cycle, essentially accelerating that release of carbon dioxide. So your natural background levels of global carbon dioxide release are 0.15 gigatons of carbon per year. That's your natural volcanic outgassing, versus around 36 gigatons of carbon per year that's then heading into the atmosphere and affecting that cycle at a global scale, no escape, maybe we would say that we are impacting the slow geological cycle more so than the fast biological cycle. Maybe. It's just one perspective. It's just one debate that we can bring in. Yeah, we're being a little bit wordy with it, but that's what the examiners want to see. So, spatial scale. In addition to this as well, and this is probably one of the easiest ways to argue this viewpoint, we're also considering this based on a timescale thing. Everything that we've considered so far in terms of our impacts on the fast biological cycle, relative to the timescales that we're talking about in terms of that entire cycle, it's all very short-term stuff. What about the long term? Yeah, what about the long term? With the extraction of fossil fuels, that process that basically has ensured that there's fossil fuels in those particular spaces has taken around 300 million years to actually get to that point. The creation of fossil fuels took place over 300 million years. So when we extract them ahead of time, we are interfering with a process that has taken 300 million years. We're affecting the slow geological cycle much more over the longer term than we are the fast biological cycle. Yeah, we're affecting the fast biological cycle over the short term much more than we are the slow geological cycle. That much is for certain. But not the long term. Over the long term, we're impacting the slow geological cycle to a far greater degree. Yeah, because everything that we're doing has a knock-on effect on a process that takes hundreds of millions of years. It's more difficult to then undo, whereas our short-term impacts on the fast biological cycle, we can actually, to a certain degree, reverse them. Yeah, or we can start to mitigate. We can start to utilize carbon capture and storage. We can start to utilize afforestation programs, which would reverse deforestation and kickstart photosynthesis again. So a lot of human activities that impact the fast biological cycle may well be short-lived. So actually, if we just change our perspective a little bit and consider this from longer-term timescales, maybe we could come to the conclusion that it's actually the slow geological cycle that we're impacting more. Then you can start to get a little bit more technical and start to think like, right, well, there's some elements of the slow geological cycle where we just say we're absolutely not impacting it, whereas we are impacting every single element of the fast biological cycle. So you can go through that. So volcanic outgassing, we aren't really impacting. Yeah, or certainly to a smaller degree, we aren't really impacting. But again, that's kind of, we can almost use the perspective of place. In most places around the world, we are absolutely impacting the fast biological cycle more so than we are impacting the slow geological cycle. It's just a fact. However, there are some places, in some isolated cases, if we just zoom in, where we are impacting the slow geological cycle to a greater degree than the fast biological cycle. And so volcanic outgassing on the whole, we don't really have much influence over that. But, and this is where we get super, super niche, the combustion of fossil fuels leading to climate change, leading to temperature rise. Where there are volcanoes that are beneath ice, yeah, so places like Iceland, where that ice is thawing like this, that means there's less downward pressure. And that's less downward pressure on magma chambers. And it's that downward pressure on magma chambers that is reducing the likelihood of them erupting. Once you reduce that pressure, you may well increase volcanic outgassing. So that yes, in most places, we definitely agree with this view, especially from the perspective of volcanic outgassing, because what influence do we have over that? We don't have any influence over the movements of tectonic plates. But in some locations, we are having, and this again is like places, super local scale, nuanced cases. There's no fast biological cycle to be influenced here at all, because it's just a volcano covered in ice. But we've changed that. Yeah, climate change is actually meaning that we are having some influence on volcanic outgassing. Okay, so then all you have to do is, once you've considered all of this from different perspectives, you then have to draw your conclusion. So your conclusion, quite simple. Where can you absolutely agree with the view? Yeah, so where can you absolutely agree with the view? You definitely agree over the short term, but over the long term, you disagree. Yeah, and you can outline that. At the global scale, it depends at what global scale you're talking about. In terms of the atmosphere, uncertain. Yeah. In terms of the oceans, yeah, we'd probably agree that we're able to influence more of the fast biological cycle in the oceans. Definitely on the terrestrial biosphere, particularly with respect to the ways that we are influencing the water cycle. Definitely, yeah. But then there's local, place-based nuances where we don't agree with this. Yeah. So it's essentially, it's a summary, but it's reasserting the perspectives that you've considered the debate from. And if you consider the debate from different perspectives and present different viewpoints and say most and least throughout that essay, you've already made judgments, you've already made conclusions, mini conclusions as you've gone along. This then just becomes a summary of those conclusions. Okay, so what perspective paragraphs do is they ensure that you are debating throughout. Okay, so I think the majority of people will be watching this back because I can see no viewers. But I will keep going with these because I know people do find them useful watching them retrospectively. So have a go at this particular essay and see how you find it. It's a good one for revising that EQ1 content in carbon, but it's also a great one for EQ2 content, EQ3 content as well when we're thinking about impacts on cycles. It's just that you go one back and you don't talk about the impacts on humans from that. Okay, so I hope that's useful to a few of you. I imagine attendance will pick up nearer to exam times, but this for me is just kind of practice. And if anyone is watching it and they want to comment in the comment section, if you want to see any lives, see me do any lives where the concept will be more useful in this stuff here. Happy to do it on absolutely anything to do with the A-level geography EdXL specification. Then please comment, give me some ideas. Thank you very much.